tariffs, there's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
North America hasn't been like this since the early 90s. Washington strikes first, Otto, and Mexico City hit back. In just a few days, the usual trade model between the US, Canada, and Mexico is turning into an economic battlefield. It's not just about tariffs anymore. The future of the North American economy is at stake. When the US president announced 25% tariffs on Canadian and Mexican steel, he called it a national security measure. But it was not a strengthening, it was a provocation, a trigger, and it worked.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
June 5th, the day when everything went downhill. Planes carrying auto parts did not take off, grain shipments were delayed, and warehouses on both sides of the border began to fill up with unsold goods. In Mexico, people immediately started talking about betrayal. In Canada, about mobilization. Food prices in the US rose by 12% in just 1 week. Manufacturers are suspending operations and retailers are asking the government for help. This is no longer a trade dispute, it is a strategic restructuring of everything that has seemed stable for the last 30 years.
I think you're going to remember today, it's going to be a free nation that we're dealing with. We're going to have a very free and beautiful nation. It's going to be Liberation Day in America, and it's going to be a day that hopefully you're going to look back in years to come and you're going to say, you know, he was right. This has turned out to be one of the most important days in the history of our country.
Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said for the first time in 3 decades that trust in the US as a partner is at risk. Mexico, in turn, is activating parallel agreements with Brazil and Chile, reorienting its supply chains. And Mexico's former trade minister is openly calling for pressure on US senators. While the White House talks about a tough stance, businesses are suffering on the ground. From Detroit's auto plants to Iowa's agribusinesses, people are losing their jobs, prices are rising, and officials continue to trade blows through the media.
US President Donald Trump has announced a 25% tariff on all car and light truck imports into the country. It's due to come into effect on April 2nd. Economists and world leaders are warning that it will be a tax on consumers and have a chilling effect on the global economy. But to Americans, Trump paints a rosy picture, predicting that the levies will spur growth.
Wine shops in British Columbia are removing US products from their shelves. The hashtag #NoMasGringo is gaining popularity on Mexican social media, calling for a boycott of American goods. Even US state governors are sounding the alarm. $500 billion in annual trade is at risk. The figures are already being bandied about. Losses in logistics amount to $23 billion, in agriculture $19 billion, and in the automotive industry $61 billion. And all this in just the first 2 weeks of the conflict.
And police in Italy are investigating possible arson after a fire destroyed more than a dozen Tesla vehicles. Elon Musk is calling the incident at a Rome dealership terrorism. This comes as Tesla has been the target of recent protests around the world.
What is going on behind the scenes? Why is the largest trading zone in the Western Hemisphere falling apart before our very eyes? Who will be the first to blink, the US, Canada, or Mexico? And most importantly, what are the real motives behind the ways, those actions? This conflict is not just about presidents and ministers. It will affect everyone, from farmers on the outskirts to shoppers in supermarkets. This is a story about power, fear, and how one political ambition can destroy what has been built over decades.
Ready? The higher the tariff, the more likely it is that the company will come into the United States and build a factory in the United States so it doesn't have to pay the tariff.
That will take many, as you know, that will take many years.
In fact, I'll tell you, you know, there's another theory is that the tariff, you make it so high, so horrible, so obnoxious that they'll come right away. When I do the 10%, 10% is really, first of all, 10% when you collect it is hundreds of billions of dollars. The numbers that you're talking, all reducing our deficit. But really, so there's 2 ways of looking at a tariff. You can do it as a money-making instrument, or you can do it as something to get the companies. Now, if you want the companies to come in.
At dawn on June 5th, borders that had recently seemed arbitrary on the map of North America regained their significance. The US officially doubled tariffs on steel and aluminum imports from Canada and Mexico. This move, explained by the White House as a matter of national security, turned out to be far from a mere economic measure. In the corridors of Congress, people whispered, "This is war, a trade war, bloodless but destructive." The reaction was immediate. In Ottawa, Prime Minister Mark Carney called an emergency cabinet meeting. By lunchtime local time, the Canadian government announced the introduction of mirror tariffs against the US. 2 shipments of American industrial machinery were detained in Vancouver, formally for additional customs inspection, but in reality as a symbol of the beginning of an economic standoff.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some, and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
Meanwhile, in Washington, the White House press secretary said at an emergency briefing that the tariff increase was critical to protecting domestic manufacturing and jobs. It sounded almost like a mantra, but behind the patriotic rhetoric lay more complex calculations. Internal sources claimed that the decision on tariffs was made not so much by economists as by political strategists hoping to boost electoral support in the Rust Belt of the US, where the metal industry has long been in decline. But no one expected the response to be so swift and organized.
That's a 10. That's a good one.
In the Canadian province of Alberta, a closed briefing was held for large business groups, where it was stated outright that preparations should be made for a large-scale trade blockade of American goods, especially in agriculture and machinery manufacturing. Later that day, at a joint press conference with the foreign minister, Prime Minister Carney stated that any attack on a Canadian manufacturer is an attack on every Canadian. His words were met with enthusiastic support, not only in Parliament, but also on the streets. A spontaneous rally attended by more than 10,000 people took place in Toronto. People carried placards reading, "We will not be humiliated," and "Our metal is our pride."
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
Meanwhile, in Mexico, a political storm was brewing. President Claudia Sheinbaum interrupted her tour of Latin America and rushed back to Mexico City. In the first hours after the announcement of the new tariffs, she addressed Parliament, calling the U.S. actions a blatant manifestation of economic blackmail. But the most striking statement came from former Trade Minister Ildefonso Guajardo, who accused Washington of violating the spirit and letter of the USMCA agreement. He also proposed a new plan, the creation of an emergency economic defense council that would bring together manufacturers, farmers, and logistics companies across the country. This idea, seemingly populist, received unexpected support in Congress. The very next day, the first initiative appeared to create a temporary compensation fund for Mexican farmers who would suffer losses from U.S. actions. It is noteworthy that even the opposition forces supported the government's measures. Mexico has not been so unanimous since the 1994 crisis.
with Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
In the US, panic broke out among importers. Car factories in Michigan reported disruptions in aluminum supplies the day after the tariffs were announced. Some commentators even claimed that the sharp increase in duties had been imposed without prior notification to major industry associations, causing chaos in logistics. In Detroit, the General Fabrications plant temporarily suspended production on one of its lines, citing a lack of Canadian alloys. In New York and Chicago, the first reports of rising consumer prices began to appear. Some states have already begun to see price hikes for beer due to the increase in the cost of aluminum cans. One manufacturer said its production costs had risen by 17% in a single day. The American Farm Bureau Federation published an open letter to Congress, calling the situation political suicide for rural businesses. Against this backdrop, the Canadian Prime Minister proposed an urgent summit of North American leaders. His idea was to try to find a compromise before the situation reached the point of no return. However, rumors were already circulating in the corridors of the negotiating groups that Mexico was considering filing a lawsuit in international arbitration. Moreover, sources close to the Canadian government claimed that the UN was preparing a draft appeal demanding a discussion on the unacceptable use of economic sanctions between allied states. While politicians exchanged statements, tensions were rising on the ground. In the US, cases of vandalism against Mexican stores began to be reported, and in Canada, boycotts of American chains became more frequent. The most resonant was a video in which the owner of a chain of wine shops in Quebec demonstratively poured American wine onto the asphalt and called for support for national producers. In the first 24 hours, the video garnered more than 3 million views and went viral. All this was happening against the backdrop of preparations for a summit scheduled for the end of June. Formally, it was supposed to be a platform for de-escalating the conflict. But unofficially, everyone understood that a gamble was being taken. Either the US would agree to concessions, or the North American trade zone would enter a period of protracted economic war. The first draft agenda for the meeting already included items such as reviewing the tariff response mechanism, guarantees and political interference in trade, and even the creation of an independent arbitration council outside the US. This meant one thing: trust in Washington as a guarantor of economic stability had been undermined. Thus, in just a few days, the familiar economic order was not merely shaken, it began to crumble before our eyes. A single political move by the US triggered a domino effect that affected 3 countries, hundreds of companies, thousands of suppliers, and millions of consumers. And if a truce is not reached in the near future, the consequences will be greater than ever before. When the economic blows began to be felt not only in the offices of ministers but also on supermarket shelves, it became clear that the trade war had entered a phase in which not only governments but also ordinary citizens were suffering. Just a week after the tariffs were introduced in the US, sharp fluctuations in the prices of basic foodstuffs began to be recorded. According to the National Association of Manufacturers, prices for dairy products rose by 9% and for grains and meat by 11% to 13% in different regions. Coastal states were particularly hard hit, as many products were previously supplied from Mexico and Canada at reduced customs rates. Now these chains have begun to break down. In Pennsylvania, for example, one of the largest retail chains has stopped selling a number of products, citing unpredictable supplies and the inability to keep prices at an acceptable level. At the same time, American car factories, many of which were dependent on North American supplies of components, faced a shortage of parts. A factory in Illinois suspended production of pickup trucks due to a lack of Canadian brake systems, and in Michigan, there were reports of reduced shifts due to engine supply disruptions. In Detroit, according to union leaders, up to 12,000 jobs were at stake. One Benton Motors executive anonymously admitted that without a return to previous trade conditions, the company would not last a month. For the first time since 2009, a number of companies returned to a 3-day work week, as was the case during the Great Recession. But it wasn't just industrial giants that found themselves on the brink. Small and medium-sized businesses began to suffer losses almost immediately. Bakeries, natural food stores, and small warehouses with raw materials all faced increased purchase prices. One family bakery owner in Texas said that due to rising prices for flour and oil, he had to temporarily shut down croissant production. Their cost price had nearly doubled. And this was not an isolated case. In California, a wave of temporary closures of farmers' markets began, especially in the southern part of the state. Producers could not cover logistics, and buyers could not afford the new prices. The internet was filled with stories of how American families began to rethink their grocery shopping, abandoning familiar brands in favor of lower quality but more affordable alternatives. Against this backdrop, Mexico and Canada launched their countermeasures. In the Canadian capital, Ottawa, a decision was made to gradually suspend purchases of certain categories of American goods for government needs. This primarily affected equipment and food. The province of Ontario suspended the signing of a contract for the supply of tractors from Wisconsin, and British Columbia initiated a campaign to support domestic producers at the local legislative level. Posters and banners with the slogan "Buy Canadian First" appeared on the streets. Although officially it was a matter of patriotism, in reality it was a hidden form of economic pressure. The Canadian market began to close. At the same time, Mexico went even further. The country's government launched the Industria Primero program aimed at developing local industries that had previously been oriented toward imports from the US. In the first few days of the initiative, 48 memoranda were signed with South American suppliers. Moreover, Mexican officials began personally inspecting American cargo at customs under the pretext of enhanced controls due to the situation. Such checks slowed deliveries by 3 to 5 days, which was critical in the context of instability. Some goods were even turned back at the border for formal reasons. A particularly high-profile case involved the rejection of a US shipment of fertilizers, allegedly due to non-compliance with environmental standards. The opposition in the US called this a hidden embargo, but Mexico officially refrained from commenting. Meanwhile, social media in both countries were filled with calls to boycott American goods. In Mexico City, a truck drove through the streets with the slogan "Sin Estados Unidos vivimos mejor," "We live better without the US." The video went viral. In Canada, activists organized a flash mob. Shoppers returned American products to stores en masse with receipts, then filmed themselves buying local products. This led to a drop in retail sales of American goods in some Canadian regions by up to 30% in 10 days. Even large retail chains began to review their contracts. For example, the well-known grocery chain True North announced that it would stop importing American meat and would work with local suppliers. This decision was met with applause, not only from consumers but also from politicians. However, the climax came in mid-June when the International North American Trade Association, a body created to monitor compliance with the USMCA, issued an emergency conclusion. It stated bluntly, "The continuation of the current tariff policy by one of the parties threatens the very existence of the agreement." This was an official alarm. The next day, the markets reacted with a fall. The S&P 500 index dropped 4.2%, and the Canadian dollar fell to its lowest level in 2 years. The Mexican peso also lost ground. But what was more important than the numbers were the consequences in the minds of people and businesses. For the first time, the term disintegration was used at the official level. Experts compared what was happening to the Brexit effect. One conflict, provoked by internal calculations, could lead to the destruction of a long-standing alliance. In Canada, discussions began on a transition to a mosaic trade model, the formation of independent agreements with Europe and Asian countries, with minimal orientation toward the US. In Mexico, there was talk of entering the Mercosur market. Such statements seemed impossible not long ago, but now they were being discussed at the federal level. While some countries were looking for alternatives, panic set in among American businesses. One of Minnesota's oldest companies, an agricultural equipment manufacturer, announced the closure of 4 plants and the layoff of 2,400 employees. In an open letter to Congress, its management stated, "We cannot operate in an environment where our closest market has become a minefield." Such sentiments grew, logistics collapsed, deliveries were disrupted, and hopes for a quick solution evaporated. The critical point was closer than anyone thought. There was no longer any talk of restoring the status quo. The question became, could the North American trade zone ever return to its pre-war format? Or had we already crossed the line into a new era where it was every man for himself? And if so, what would be the cost of this transition for ordinary people, for national economies, for future generations? There are no answers yet. But the consequences are already here, and they are only growing.